They say, if you arrive at this old hotel after midnight, you may be given the key to the last room. There are no stories of evil spirits here, no curse carved into the walls. It is simply a house where someone never truly left. For more than a century, the mansion has stood along the Burmese coast, facing the sea as though waiting for someone to return. Travelers knew there was one unwritten rule about this place. No one ever spoke of it. Yet everyone who stayed here seemed to understand it by morning. No one called the hotel haunted, yet many guests checked out with the very same story. They never truly slept. Long ago, this was the mansion of a wealthy Burmese family. After the owner's death, it became a heritage hotel. One stormy night, a foreign travel writer arrived just before midnight. He had spent years documenting forgotten places across Asia. By the time he arrived, every room in the hotel had already been occupied. Outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping. It was well past midnight, and there would be no transportation until morning. The writer insisted that he only needed a place to stay for one night. The hotel clerk remained silent for a long moment. At last, he reached beneath the counter and took out an old brass key. It belonged to the last room. Before climbing the stairs, his gaze settled on a large oil portrait hanging on the stairwell wall. An elderly Burmese gentleman sat quietly in the portrait. His expression was calm, yet there was something strangely possessive in his eyes. The writer instinctively raised his camera and took a photograph. He had no idea that it would become the first photograph of a night he would never forget. His room was old, carrying a faint scent of age, yet it had been carefully renovated. Everything looked simple, clean, and unexpectedly comfortable. Beyond the large windows, the sea stretched endlessly into the darkness. For a while, there was only the sound of rain and the sea. Then, a wooden plank outside the room slowly creaked. He paid little attention to it. Old buildings always had their own voices. But only moments later, another sound broke the silence. Footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. They passed one room, then another, drawing closer with every step. Then they stopped directly outside his door. The silence that followed felt unnaturally long. Finally, he got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. Only the sea continued speaking somewhere beyond the darkness. He closed the door and returned to bed. Perhaps he had imagined everything. But the moment he lay down again, water began running in the bathroom. He slowly walked toward the sound. The old brass faucet was open. He was certain he had never touched it. He reached out and turned it off. His fingers had already begun to tremble. He stood there listening. Nothing, only the rain outside. Slowly, he returned to bed. At last, exhaustion pulled him into sleep. In his dream, An old man carrying a lantern walked silently through the mansion. He opened each room, looked inside, then gently closed the door again. He did not look angry. He did not look lost. He looked like a man quietly checking on his own house. Then he stopped in front of one particular room. Slowly, he opened the door. Inside, the travel writer was sleeping peacefully. The old man stood there for a long moment before quietly saying, "You've entered the wrong room." Silence filled the room. Then his voice came once more. "This room still has an owner." He slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the door. "Leave." The writer jolted awake. Outside the window, the sky was still completely dark. He tried to fall asleep once more. This time, he turned onto his side. Somewhere between sleep and waking, his body suddenly froze. He couldn't move, not even a finger. Some instinct deep inside him whispered he was no longer alone. Someone was standing behind him. He could feel an icy presence lingering only inches away. It wasn't warmth, only an unnatural cold slowly spreading across the back of his neck. Then came a faint scent. Old teak wood, damp air, and the lingering scent of an old oil lantern. The same scent that had welcomed him into the mansion hours before. He wanted to turn around. He wanted to scream, but nothing responded. He could only lie there, trapped between terror and helplessness. Every second felt endless, until the first light of dawn finally slipped through the curtains. Only then did the crushing presence finally disappear. At first light, he packed his belongings without looking back at the room one last time. He returned the brass key at the reception desk. The hotel clerk accepted the key in silence. Before putting it away, he quietly asked whether the writer had managed to get any sleep the night before. The writer could only force a faint smile and admit that he had barely slept at all. The clerk gave a small nod, as though he had expected that answer all along. He simply took the key and said nothing more. His train would be leaving soon, but before leaving, instinct made him stop one last time. He photographed the lobby, the grand staircase, the balcony overlooking the sea, the long hallway outside his room. Finally, he stepped outside the mansion. He placed his camera on a tripod, set the timer, and walked into the frame. He packed away his camera and hurried to the station, never checking a single photograph. Hours later, as the train carried him farther from the coast, he finally turned on his camera. The first photograph, the lobby. At the far edge of the frame, Behind a wooden pillar stood an old man. He frowned. Perhaps it was just another guest. The second photograph, the staircase. The same old man now stood halfway up the stairs. The third photograph, the balcony. The old man stood alone, quietly facing the sea. The fourth photograph, the hallway outside his room. The old man stood silently at the end of the corridor. Only then did the writer recognize the face. It was the same man from the oil portrait hanging beside the staircase. His hand began to tremble. There was only one photograph left. The self-portrait in front of the mansion. He opened it. Everything looked exactly as he remembered. He was standing alone in front of the mansion, but behind him, less than a step away, stood the old owner of the house. His hands were folded before him. His face remained calm. In every photograph before, he had never looked toward the camera. But in this final photograph, he was staring directly into the lens. The writer could no longer hear the train. At that moment, he understood. The house had never been empty. The last room was never just the last room available. It was the one room that should never have been opened again. Some people leave their homes forever. Others never do.